Chapter 1. The monk left this world. "Your Majesty, please spare Queen Inha. She is innocent." The shrill and desperate cries of the monk reverberated across the king's palace early that morning. Even on that cold morning, sweat could be seen rolling down the monk's shaved head because he has been kneeling right outside the king's residence for a while now. This monk was no other than Ah Hyuk, who had just been accused of having an affair with Queen Inha, and he was here to defend her. It was a miracle that since the rumors spread that the king hasn't ordered his head yet, and was calm about it, hoping the rumors would be cleared with the due investigation. However, that was until he heard that the young queen had been sent to the cold palace, and he knew he couldn't hold it in anymore. And Hyuk knew then that he couldn't sit back and watch, not even when the abbot warned him that he would be signing his death if he went to the palace. But what could he do? He couldn't stay still and watch Queen Inha get punished for a crime she didn't commit. Those were just rumors. How could the king take it seriously? The queen's faithfulness towards him is anything but questionable. It was due to her devotion to her husband that she came to the temple every time to pray for his well-being. Everyone in the kingdom knew the queen was an avid prayer, hence her frequent visits to the temple. Ahya couldn't forget the woman who would give alms to the poor and made sure the monastery was in good shape. Such a kind spirit, he wouldn't let that go to waste, even if it was at the expense of his own life. With just a look, one could see that An Hyuk's legs were numb from kneeling for far too long, while his hands trembled even as he bowed his head once more. His voice was hoarse, with his lips almost turning blue from staying on the outside all night long. Nonetheless, he went on to appeal to the king with a loud voice. "Your Majesty, please spare Queen Inha. She is innocent. The queen has been falsely accused. Please launch an investigation panel to look into it. The queen is being falsely accused." Meanwhile, unknown to the monk, His Majesty Daehyun was in a meeting with the Prime Minister, and sprawled across him were paper evidence of his affairs with the Queen. His Majesty Daehyun fisted his hand till his knuckles turned white while veins bulged from his neck, his nostrils flaring. After everything, it turns out that she had been fooling him. Unknown to the king, a hidden smile crossed the Prime Minister's features as he spread the papers further apart, saying, "It was hard to find, but these are poems they sent each other in the secret. My men did a hard job of digging it up from her courtyard where she buried it." His words were evidenced by the soiled papers with some parts already peeling off. However, the writing was unmistakable, and the king could recognize the young queen's writing even in his sleep. "The other one must belong to that lowly monk. How dare he? They dared to fool him? Him, the king of this great kingdom?" To add fuel to the fire, the monk's voice came alive at that moment from the courtyard. "Your Majesty, the queen is innocent. Please investigate properly." Those words from the monk were like a big slap to the face of the king, Daehyun, who already had evidence of his wife's unfaithfulness. The red-hot anger running through his veins distorted his features so much that he looked like he was morphing into a monster at that moment. At once, he grasped the paper evidence in his hand and went to the wall where his great sword hung and pulled it out of the scabbard in one move. "Your Majesty, the Prime Minister hurriedly stood to his feet at once when he saw the king striding out of the quarters furiously. He pretended to stop him, but the Majesty wasn't listening, and as soon as he left, a dark smile curled his lips. This was the end for Queen Inha. Now his daughter would have a better chance with the king. He would make that happen. Inha would be stripped of her title and demoted, if not divorced, and she would be sent away. Then he would convince His Majesty to take his daughter as queen, and then, his family would be in the position of power that they deserved. Isn't it perfect? Machawale and Mirwana nodded in synchrony. At the same time, Ayuk, who had no idea of the storm brewing, was still on his knees, begging for the Majesty's pardon when the door to the king's quarters was opened and His Majesty stalked towards him, sword in hand. Sahata, Ahiat gulped. He knew with the fury in the king's eyes that things were looking bad. Yet he still bravely said, "Your Majesty." He didn't get to finish the rest of his words because the king kicked him right in the chest and he tumbled back. Pain shot right through him, but he still forced himself into a kneeling position.
It.
He slowly lifted his head, pleading, "Your Majesty, please spare Queen Ingha. She's being wrongly accused." "Wrongly accused?" The king sneered, his eyes burning with fire. "What do you mean by wrongly accused when I have the evidence here?" He flung the papers at his face. With furrowed brows, Ahyuk picked up the papers and one could see the shock that spread through him as his jaw dropped. Huh? The writing was his, and he had written the poems himself. As a monk who lived simply and traveled around, he usually penned down his love for nature. How had the king gotten his hands on them? Those papers were missing a month ago, and he had forgotten about them until now. The king was disappointed when he saw the recognition on the monk's face. Just as he thought, the prime minister was right. The queen indeed had an affair, but with a measly monk? That was a huge slap on his face. If she was going to have an affair, why couldn't she do it with someone better? Well, why a monk? Your Majesty? Ayuk held the paper with trembling hands. "This is no proof that the queen had an affair." The king glared at him. "You're trying to say that the writing isn't yours?" "No, yes, it is, Your Majesty." He was quick to acknowledge it, knowing the king's patience was running out. "However, this isn't solid proof that those letters were found buried in the queen's courtyard. How is that not proof of her affair?" The king thundered, looming over him threateningly. "Your Majesty." Bahyak fell on his face at once. The situation was not looking good for him. "Please reconsider, Your Majesty. I'm just a lonely monk with no earthly desire and no lust for sex," he pleaded. But the king snorted in disgust. "So, you are trying to say that this is all the queen's fault? Then how come I received reports of you going to the queen's tent at night during her last visit to the temple?" Instantly sweat rolled down the monk's head. How did the king know of that? Moreover, how was he going to explain that to the king when he promised the queen to keep it a secret, not to mention that it bring her nothing but trouble? The queen had commanded her people to sneak out the king's favorite sword, gifted to him by the late king, his father. However, it was with good intention. The king didn't share an appreciation for spiritual values, and with the war looming with the neighboring West country, the queen wanted him to bless the sword. Her hands fell shaking. Her lips had started to tremble. The abbot would have done it, but he had gone on a spiritual walk. Neither could people have knowledge of the sword. Hence the queen invited the monk she trusted the most, and that was him. The sword arrived late at night because they waited for the king to leave before replacing it with a fake. Ahyak blessed the sword as the queen wanted, but took an oath of silence, knowing the repercussion if the news were to spread that the young queen took the king's favorite sword without his permission. As if the universe was taunting him, Ahyak saw the king holding the sword. Would he be killed with the same sword that he blessed? That was the thought that crossed his mind at that moment. "Your Majesty." Heavy sweat rolled down his face this time. "I'm sorry, but I swore an oath of silence regarding that matter." He saw his end coming now. "Oh, really?" the king said calmly. But Hyuk was not fooled by that demeanor. There was a crazed glint in the king's eyes, and he just disrespected the king by refusing to tell him the truth of that night. He was as good as a dead. "And you refuse to tell the truth and acknowledge your crime? I should end your miserable life then." The enraged king raised his sword to cut his head off his body, and Hyuk shut his eyes close. "His time has come." "Your Majesty," the prime called from behind, and the king's sword halted in the air. The man in his official uniform walked over to the king and whispered into his ears, "Your Majesty, please calm down. He's still a discipline of the Luai temple. You would lose favor with the people if you kill him with your bare hands." He hinted that the monk should be given a public punishment. And of course, the king understood, because he commanded, "Who's there?" Immediately, the captain of the guards left his post and bowed before him. "At your service, Your Majesty." "Hear my verdict," the king roared. "Because he has been accused and found guilty of having romantic entanglement with a member of the royal family, my wife, the queen of this nation, his punishment would be death by hanging," he decreed. Although Hyuk knew he had met his end, he still couldn't help but tremble at his death sentence. He was going to die for a crime he didn't commit. Even at that, his only concern was the queen. He would gladly give up his life for her. "Your Majesty, what about the queen? She did not do anything wrong. What would happen to her?" But the king didn't give him a reply. If anything, he was beyond furious. Even in the face of death, he still dared to worry about the queen. Wasn't that proof of how much in love he was with the queen? That was a huge blow to the king, and he felt inferior and jealous. Had he not loved the queen enough? But then, his huge ego would not let him admit it. "Let's go, Your Majesty," cried the prime minister, interrupted him from his reverie, leading him along the way. He had seen the longing look in the king's eyes and didn't like it. Nothing can interrupt his plans now. "Please answer me, Your Majesty." Hyuk shot up to his feet and tried to go after the king, but his legs were numb from kneeling for far too long, and he fell, allowing the captain to catch up to him. "Let's go," the captain ordered, grabbing him by the scruff of the neck as other guards came to assist him. "Your Majesty, please spare the queen," Hyuk prayed. He was giving up his own life for the queen, so she deserved to live. Hyuk was dragged away like a criminal, but he didn't curse any of them, because by oneself indeed is evil done. By oneself is one defiled. By oneself is evil left undone. By oneself indeed is one purified. Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one purifies another. As a monk, he has reached an unselfish, loving, pure state of mind, and if this is the burden he has to bear, then so be it. Hyuk was given a public execution, and as he climbed up the gallows to accept his punishment, while the captain read out his offense, he still had a smile on his face. The people who had come to watch his execution were crying, and he recognized them as some of the people he had helped. In the end, all that mattered was what he'd be remembered for when he left this world. He was satisfied by that. Hyuk only hoped the queen doesn't blame herself too much for his death. This was the price he had to pay. The people's wail intensified when the noose was placed around his neck, but he was calm, reading the scripture to them about love and endurance until it was time. Since Hyuk had been standing on a raised stool, all the guard did was kick it away, leaving him dangling from the rope. Suspended by the neck, the weight of his body tightened the noose around the neck, affecting strangulation. The process was designed to break his neck and choke him to death as efficiently as possible. Hence, Ah Hyuk was killed quickly and relatively painlessly. Thus, on that bright and sunny day, Ah Hyuk, the monk, left this world. Chapter 2. Her son would never be the same. Ah Hyuk woke up to blinding light and a throbbing headache that left him disoriented for a while. What was going on? Where was he? The last thing he remembered was getting hanged. And then here? Where is here? Most importantly, how was he alive? Could it be that he was reborn? Nara shook her head. When someone dies, their energy passes into another form. Good actions will result in a better rebirth, while bad actions will have the opposite effect. Ayuk hoped he was reborn in a better place. However, the first thing Ayuk heard when his head cleared a bit was a loud beeping sound. What was going on? It didn't sound like the bell used in the monastery. Where is this place? Most importantly, why wasn't he in the womb? Wait a minute. Could it be he transmigrated? How was that possible? He was thinking about rebirth. Well, there is a cycle of transmigration consisting of rebirth and redeath as the fundamental nature of existence. 3. Ungmaster is awake. A loud shriek woke him from his thought, and Ayuk forgot all about the transmigration issue because there was a blurry of activities in the next minute. He whirled to see a man walk across the court. The loud footsteps he heard next told him that it wasn't just one person that entered the room. The next minute he was probed and harassed as he felt hands on him. How dare they touch him like that? He was a holy disciple of the Luai temple. They had no right to treat him this way. However, when he opened his mouth to speak, Ahyuk found out that it was as dry as a desert. He was parched. As if that was not enough, one of them stretched his eyes open, pointing a bright light at his eye. Ahyuk winced, his pupils constricting at once. And at that response, the doctor let go. Horahuak heard a series of conversations afterward, but he couldn't understand a thing, and he was so tired that he was losing consciousness once again. Oh no, he can't sleep now. He had to know where he was. But sleep took over. He couldn't tell how long he slept, but when Ahyuk woke up, someone was squeezing his hand tight. His blurry eyesight cleared, and there was an older woman by his side with tears streaming down her face. "Daniel, my poor son," she wept, holding onto his hands for dear life. "Daniel?" Hyuk frowned. That was a strange name. Most of all, was it the name of the former owner of this body? As soon as he thought of that name, a searing headache made him wince, and soon enough, strange memories filled his head. Ahyuk was able to understand that these memories belonged to the former owner of this body. It seems the former owner of this body died from an accident, and the more Ahyuk accessed his memory, the more appalled he was. The former Daniel lived a life that could make a monk flush in embarrassment, and he was one. Hot drops of water formed around Daniel's head, waiting to drip. Ahyuk frowned. Of all bodies he could transmigrate into, why this one? This body has committed a lot of sin and immoral acts that Ahyuk knew he would need to read a lot of scriptures and meditation to cleanse his mind once more. How could someone live like this? If only Ahyuk knew he has stepped into the 21st century. The older woman by his side finally noticed his discomfort and looked down, shock on her face. "Son, you are awake." She was relieved. Ahyuk frowned. "Tuamelt?" He tried to recognize her from the previous owner's memory and found nothing. "Daniel?" the woman choked out, shock on her face as the tears flowed faster. "Son, it's me, your grandma." She tapped her chest, as if that would help him recognize. Ah Hyuk searched deep into the previous owner's memory, and the features of his grandmother matched the one standing before him. But by the time he was done scrutinizing her, the woman had already called over the doctor and nurses to check up on her grandson because he was behaving strangely. When the nurses surrounded him, Ah Hyuk's eyes almost bulged out of his socket when he saw the nurses in their scrub that was short-sleeved, and most of all, they were unpants. What kind of abomination is this? What kind of world did he transmigrate to? What is— Hyuk was desperate for answers. There were many questions in his head. Why were the women dressed this way, and why wasn't the man beside them in his white coat saying a word about it? Unfortunately, the nurses mistook him for having a panic attack, or maybe he did have one. Ah Hyuk just didn't recognize it, so they had no choice but to sedate him once again while his grandmother cried by the corner. "Doctor, what is going on with my grandson? He couldn't even recognize me when he woke up?" the woman asked the doctor as soon as Daniel fell into another sleep again. "Don't worry, he'd come around. He must be traumatized by the incident, and that's pretty common among patients like him. However, there's nothing a little therapy won't do, although we would have to run a few more tests and scans once he awakes to see if a part of his brain was affected in the accident. But don't worry, I'm sure your grandson would be fine." "I pray so," Grandma King said. If only she knew her son would never be the same again. More days passed, and Ah Hyuk was still under observation. His panic attack had stopped, but his behaviors were strange, and not even the doctors could understand that. Anne had been reading the latest book on medicine for the depression, along with Grandma. There had been some trials lately with the medicine since the doctor said to Grandma Kong, but after thinking about it for some time, the both of them stood at the corner of the hospital garden, watching Daniel, who was touching everything he could get his hands on. His eyes were wide, and he seemed to take everything in with a euphoric expression. Kroje closed the door behind them. However, as soon as he saw a woman dressed in nothing but shorts and a shirt, he turned away at once, red-faced. It's been a few days since Ah Hyuk recovered, and he still couldn't get used to this world he was currently in. Although the previous owner's memory was there to guide him, there was still a huge difference between seeing and feeling. This life was totally different and grander from his past life. It was hard to believe that this is the future. "What do you suggest I do, doctor?" Grandma Kang asked him. As much as she was grateful that her grandson was alive, she wanted his sound health as well, and right now he was scaring her with his recent bizarre characters. "Why, days ago, he ordered that all the nurses coming to check up on him should be covered up properly, or else they can't see him." It was pretty impossible to do that, but with her power, Grandma Kong was able to pay off a nurse to go with his idea. That wasn't the only thing. Ever since he woke up, he demanded that his diet should be changed and his food be simpler and bland. In his own language, he had no desire for luxury and the pleasure of life. Thinking about the recent changes in his character made her head throb. The doctor went on to say, in many cases, amnesia resolves without treatment. However, if an underlying physical or mental disorder is present, treatment for that condition may be necessary. Include physical activity in his daily routine, help him stay mentally active, give him a healthy diet, and most of all, give him time. I've seen cases like this, and they always resolve with time. They diagnosed his condition as a rare case of amnesia since he couldn't remember certain events in his life. The doctor added, "And a lot of affection. Your grandson needs you now more than ever." Emmy pushed to stand to her full height. Grandma King looked at her grandson with tears in her eyes. The doctor was right. She can't give up on Daniel now. Moreover, she promised his parents to take care of him. So even if Daniel didn't behave the same as before, he was still grandson to her. Ah Hyuk enjoyed the joy of being outside. He was cooped up in the room all day. This previous owner's grandmother placed bodyguards at the entrance that made sure he didn't go anywhere, and even if he did, it was with permission. Having been an active person and a wanderer in his previous life, it was hard for Ah Hyuk to adapt quickly. It was hard to believe that just days ago he was executed publicly, and now he transmigrated into the body of another. However, from what he has seen from this world so far, it was full of corruption and immorality, but then, he won't be swayed. He would remain steadfast in his faith and would be the one to bring change in this degrading world. Yes, that was his decision. Ah Hyuk decided he would live as Daniel and would treat the grandmother of the previous Daniel well. The first owner died, and he took over, which means he inherited his responsibilities as well. But that would be done in his own way. This world would not change him. Days later, it was time for Ah Hyuk to be discharged from the hospital. His grandmother, alongside a staff member, was there to help him pack his stuff. The communication was weird at first, but Ah Hyuk learned to get used to his grandmother, and things were going well. Until it was time to leave in the car. "What are you waiting for? Get in!" Grandmother Kang shouted at her grandson, who remained standing outside when he should have gotten into the car already. Ah Hyuk stared at the sleek and beautiful body of the car and decided he couldn't use this. He was taught not to become overly attached to things like wealth and status. At once, Ah Hyuk bowed to his grandmother. "I'm sorry, Grandma, but I can't use something like this." "What?" The woman almost spat blood. What was wrong with this son of hers? "Perhaps, if you can show me the way, I can trek back home." Ah Hyuk was confident in doing that, since he walked around a lot in his previous life. "Trek, huh?" There was a sudden glint in Grandma's eyes, and she signaled to the guards, who at once grabbed Ah Hyuk and began to pull him into the car. Grandmother Kang was determined, whether it took 100 or 1,000 years, she would bring back Daniel to the way he was.